everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. My name is Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to talk about the rise of Skywalker. We're considering this kind of a supplement to our full episode of the Disney Star Wars. We did one other supplement before on The Mandalorian, so we decided to do it here as well. Just a quick note we want to make. You may notice a difference in the audio quality on this. We are currently doing this from quarantine over Skype. Probably next couple episodes are going to sound like this, so we apologize if there is, noticeable issues in the audio, but we wanted to get that content out there so you guys aren't too bored while you're sitting in your homes. So we got a lot of good feedback on the Dark Knight trilogy episode we had done. One of the things people really liked was us kind of doing a quick run through of the plot of the films before we got into it. We're going to continue that today. I think we'll be honest with our crowd here. This is not the first time we've tried to record this summary.
We were recounting the plot and we were getting a bunch of details wrong, so we decided to start fresh because quite a lot happens.
Yeah, it's almost 3 hours long, but even so, I would say that this is probably 4 or 5 hours of plot in a lot of movies. And that's why we were kind of stumbling over it. So we think we've got it good now. When we make mistakes, you're more than welcome to tell us in the comments, but we're not going to change the episode. So Christian has proven to be much better at this than I am. I may jump in here and there, but Christian, why don't you go ahead with as brief of a plot summary as we possibly can make of this movie.
Like I said, there's a lot that happens, and we'll get into maybe the reasons why afterward. So the movie starts out with a very important title crawl where we find out that Emperor Palpatine is alive. Kylo Ren is now searching for a way to contact him. Meanwhile, Rey is on a planet with Leia training her force powers. Meanwhile, Poe and Finn are trying to contact a spy within the First Order that is feeding them information about what's going on. So the movie starts out with Kylo Ren descending to a planet, killing a bunch of aliens in a pretty cool scene, and then finding what some people might know as a holocron. It's basically like a little pyramid thing, but what the movie refers to as a wayfinder. And this wayfinder leads Kylo Ren to the planet Exegol. Kylo Ren descends into the depths of Exegol and finds out that Emperor Palpatine is indeed alive. And Palpatine tells Kylo Ren that he is the master of Snoke, and thus the master of him, and that he has a new plan to build a new order, a Sith order. And through that, he reveals his fleet of ships that darken the sky of Exegol, because there's just that many ships. We then cut to Finn and Poe and Chewbacca flying to another planet to meet their spy. The spy feeds them information, and they narrowly escape the First Order trying to track them down. Finn, Poe, and Chewbacca take this information to another planet where Rey is training with Leia to train her force powers. They trade information, they swap information, and basically they find out that Emperor Palpatine is indeed alive. He has a fleet on Exegol, and Kylo Ren is working with him. So it's pretty dire, but Rey remembers that she read something about some kind of Sith planet in her Jedi Order tomes. Because at the end of The Last Jedi, she has the Jedi Order text. And the Jedi Order texts talk about a wayfinder. So Rey's like, let's go find this wayfinder. And everyone agrees. And they go find it. Initially, they go to the planet Basana, where they believe a clue is hidden. On that planet, there is a festival. And they go to the festival. And eventually, they meet up with Lando Calrissian. Lando Calrissian warns them about where the Sith thingy could be, and he tells them that it might be somewhere out in the desert and it belonged to a Jedi hunter named Oichi. So they go to the desert and they're saved by the Sith along the way. They eventually fall into a bunch of tunnels beneath the planet where they find out that Oichi has been dead for quite a while, and all that remains is his dagger. On the dagger is a bunch of Sith text that C-3PO translate, but he can't tell them because he's forbidden from saying the Sith language. It's within his program. So they're like, okay, what now? As they try to regroup and come up with a new plan, they're attacked by the Knights of Ren and Kylo Ren. The Knights of Ren kidnap Chewbacca and flee with him. Kylo Ren and Rey fight, and Rey reveals that she has some kind of dark Sith powers because she uses Force Lightning, which is a pretty high level Sith power if you played any fucking Star Wars game. And she blows up a ship. They believe that Chewbacca is dead, and they're like, oh no, what do we do? And they escape to Oichi's ship that has also been hidden on this. Rey's like, this ship looks familiar. I don't know why. That is odd. I hope this doesn't come up again. Poe then suggests that they go to Kijimi, where she knows somebody that might be able to hack C-3PO's memory and get him to say the Jedi Sith text that's on the dagger that has a clue to the next wayfinder. They go to Kijimi, that's a hard word to say, and they find that it's being currently occupied. So they had to sneak around, and they meet with Zori Bliss, who is an old acquaintance of Poe. And we find out that both Zori and Poe used to be spice runners. And they heckle each other a bit, but eventually they're able to hack C-3PO's memory. C-3PO tells them where the next thing could be, and it's apparently on Endor. But during this point, Rey finds out, she uses her force powers, and she's like, oh my god, Chewbacca's still alive. So they're like, okay, let's go to the ship where Chewbacca is and save him. So they do that, but during their breakout attempt, Kylo Ren reveals that her parents were not nobodies, they were in fact somebody, and they hid her on Jakku to protect her. They don't quite reveal why at this moment. As they try to escape because Kylo Ren's chasing after them, General Hux saves them and reveals himself as the spy that has been feeding them information. He helps them escape, and as they escape, Kylo Ren once again corners them and reveals to them that she is Palpatine's daughter, that Rey is Palpatine's daughter. And it's a big dramatic moment. But thanks to Hux, they're able to escape, and they've used the Sith dagger from C-3PO to reveal that they need to go to Endor, where the second Death Star is. They go to Endor, they go to the second Death Star, and they're rummaging around it, and they indeed do find the Wayfinder. But Kylo Ren at the same time shows up once again and destroys the Wayfinder. Rey and Kylo Ren have a pretty big fight. There's lots of stabbies, and Ren tries to kill Rey, but Leia uses her force powers to distract Kylo Ren, and Rey's able to stab Kylo Ren, and he's dying. But then Rey uses her force powers to heal Kylo Ren before they leave. And during this moment, Kylo Ren also converses with his father, his force ghost of a father, and his father asks him to become Ben Solo instead of Kylo Ren again. At the same time, Rey talks to Luke's force ghost, and Luke is like, you should take Leia's lightsaber because she also trained with me to become a Jedi, but she gave up the practice because she wanted to be a politician. Rey then leaves, and everything converges basically onto Exegol because they all have the map now, thanks to several other circumstances that are kind of complicated and are not really worth going into. As they all go to Exegol, Rey descends down to the planet and confronts Palpatine, her father. And Palpatine's like, if you strike me down, I'll take over your body as a ghost. And you don't want that, but I want that. And then Kylo Ren shows up shortly after. Again, Kylo Ren has a habit of just showing up.
And I think it's important to note that it's Ben Solo at this point. Kylo Ren has now been undone. He is no longer that person.
Right, because of earlier where he was talking to Han Solo, and Han Solo encourages him to become Ben Solo instead of Kylo Ren. So Rey's talking to Palpatine in the depths of Exegol, and Palpatine reveals his big master plan is that he will become the one true Sith, and he will do this by taking over Rey's body, because Rey has both kind of the powers of Luke and the powers of Palpatine. So she makes like the ultimate body to host. But Rey has to kill Palpatine first in order for Palpatine's spirit to possess her body. At the same time, the Resistance comes to Exegol and starts attacking the warships they have. And the original plan is to attack a radio tower that is directing the fleet off of the planet. They changed the radio tower, they changed the signal to a different spaceship, which is the head fleet spaceship, and the Resistance decides to attack that ship. And they do that by landing on the ship and doing like a ground force attack on the First Order flagship. Meanwhile, Kylo Ren, or I should say Ben Solo, also arrives on Exegol and chases after Rey and helps Rey fight off the Sith. At this time, Ben Solo also kills the Knights of Ren, and together they attack Palpatine. During this point, they also destroy the First Order flagship, and then all the universe shows up, and they all attack the First Fleet, which is now in disarray. At the same time, Rey and Ben Solo kill Palpatine, but in the process, Ben Solo sacrifices his life. And Palpatine's forever destroyed, and the Sith Order is destroyed. Rey and Ben kiss. He dies because Ben Solo used his Force powers to revive Rey from their climactic battle with Emperor Palpatine, because Palpatine did kill her briefly. She gets better.
I think it's important here to throw in too that Rey hears the voices of many, many Jedi across both the film and television projects, which is going to be important with what we're discussing.
Yeah, she basically feels all the. It's supposed to be implied that she's all the Jedi fighting all of the Sith, metaphorically, at the very least. So the Force, the Sith fucking order is destroyed, and they all go to Tatooine and they all celebrate, and they're all like, "Wow, this is great! What an adventure!" And the last scene has Rey going to Tatooine to Luke's abandoned home and burying the Skywalker lightsaber, both Luke's and Leia's lightsaber, in Luke's old home. And then she sees the spirit of Luke and Leia, and a passerby asks Rey, "What is your name? What is your family?" And she says, "I am Rey Skywalker." The end.
And thus the Skywalker rises.
Yes, because she is the Skywalker, and that is the end of the Skywalker Saga, allegedly.
And she also had her own lightsaber, a yellow lightsaber, which is a Guardian lightsaber.
That is like the final moments of the film. I don't. Is it the split lightsaber? Is it like the Darth Maul lightsaber? I believe it is.
It is a longer handled lightsaber, and that's something we can talk about in a little bit too, with some of the things that have come out since this movie came out. So yeah, that's the terrifically complex plot of The Rise of Skywalker. We didn't even hit on all the details that are in there either.
No, there's a lot of subtle details that we get that just were not important to the overall plot, like things like C-3PO losing his memory, a lot of the side plots. But if we do get anything wrong, please correct us. It is just a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, we're not changing anything. But yeah, still, tell us. And just to give us a little context too, we talk about this a lot more on the longer podcast, but Colin Trevorrow was leading up both the screenplay and originally was going to direct what would be this film. That was thrown out for whatever reasons you'd like to believe it was. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. And J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio, best known for Argo and Batman vs. Superman, come on to this script and are going to wrap it up. My first comment on this is this sort of rapid fire, relying on a lot of visual storytelling to convey plot and relying on the audience inferring is kind of Terrio's style.
Yeah, if you've seen Argo, which you should, it's very similar to that in that like a lot of stuff just happens and it's very hard to recount, but it is always at least visually engaging. Same thing with Batman vs. Superman. Quite a lot happens in that film too, and it tries to deal with a lot of themes at the same time. And I'm sure we'll have an episode later on about the whole Batman vs. Superman DC unit.
Yeah, I know. It's really funny. Batman vs. Superman, in a very direct way, led to the launch of Dissecting Fiction. That's not an exaggeration at all. I happen to be a very big fan of that movie, and I felt like a lot of the coverage for it was unreasonably negative and just sort of bizarre. And part of the reason the website started was because we were looking to create a platform that was a little more like positive than a lot of places were being at the time. That's 3 years ago now. And I think that problem has subsided a little bit, which is good. I feel like we were part of the correction of that. But I'm a big fan of Chris Terrio's type of screenwriting. And I'll say now, that we've gotten through all this, that I really like The Rise of Skywalker.
I think Terrio's screenwriting works in certain circumstances. I don't think this is the circumstance it works in. I don't really disagree with what he wrote, but I think it's like what they do I disagree with.
Okay. Okay, so let's start like kind of going through what we just talked about, in a more analytical sense. You have, and arguably the biggest thing in this entire movie is that you are thrown into Palpatine being alive.
Yeah, when I heard about this before seeing the movie, but it is jarring how quickly they just introduce it. I mean, I'm sure there's other novels that explain why, but I do not. I think a lot of this has to do with The Last Jedi, and like the way I saw this was that I saw all the Star Wars movies in a row before this, and this is supposed to be kind of the culmination of the entire Star Wars saga, or the Skywalker Saga, as they're now calling. And watching them all in a row was really interesting, and it was kind of enlightening to see like where each of them falls in line, because like the further down the line you get, the more each film is a reaction to the last one. I think it kind of starts around Attack of the Clones. Return of the Sith was very much a reaction against for multiple reasons, because Attack of the Clones is kind of the worst Star Wars.
I don't think. There are occasionally times where we are a little negative, and as I will always say, Iron Man 3 is absolutely the worst. Well, I can't say always because we still have 400 of them coming. Like Iron Man 3 at current is the worst MCU movie. I will 100% say that Attack of the Clones is the worst Star Wars movie. You're touching on something there that's true, and this is something that I did want to get into, especially as we're talking about this film, is sort of the nature of Star Wars changing. When you had the original trilogy, you really had novels, things around it, but that the general public wasn't accessing in any significant way. Because of how many movies there are now, and because of how many TV shows, and the Disney policy that anything they put out is in continuity, I think the nature of it has changed, and I think this movie is almost a reaction to it. I think this movie, and I understand the criticism of saying like, well, you didn't explain it in the movie. How do you have the audience understand what's going on? I get that, but I'm also really tied into the other side of it, where it wasn't that jarring to hear that Palpatine was alive, and I started immediately thinking about ways that he could be, and in most of those respects is exactly what happens in the movie. So there is this commitment to the logic that's been established in other Star Wars projects that continues in this. And that's something that I'm going to keep touching upon as we discuss that, is this movie is very tied in. And I think, yes, they do end up throwing out some of the thematics from Last Jedi, but if you're going by plot points in Last Jedi, it does acknowledge it. It's not like it's moving completely away.
No, it does, but I feel like thematically, like it moves entirely away from what the Last Jedi was trying to present. Because like I said, I saw this all kind of in a row. I spent like a week like watching one Star Wars movie every day, and there is like kind of a weird flow between all of them. And like to suddenly have Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and then Palpatine to show up in like the Rise of Skywalker, it does feel jarring in that respect, especially because it's like suddenly it's the first line, Palpatine's alive again. I also don't really agree with them having to bring Palpatine back. I felt like there was stuff you could have worked with in Last Jedi. But it was also like, I think my appreciation for Last Jedi grew, not because of this film, but because of watching all the Star Wars movies in a row. Because in a weird way, Last Jedi was kind of talking about oh, what if you couldn't turn Darth Vader? What if Luke lost hope? And then Rise of Skywalker is much more like a classical Star Wars story, and I think it does that to a fault.
That's funny, and I would, to a fault is obviously where we're going to disagree. I agree with you on that. I think part of what the movie does is go back to a lot of things that were previously established. You don't need even to read any of like the leaked scripts or anything that was supposed to be Episode 9 to know that Johnson was moving towards this idea of not only sort of dismissing the idea of Jedi being good and Sith being evil, but focusing more on this idea of balance. One of my problems with that, ultimately, The Rise of Skywalker solves, because we've had proof over and over again that the Sith, at some level, are evil. And while this sort of general idea of the dark side could be folded into something outside of that, that specific idea of how the Force works is wrong. And I kind of like that this hammers on that a little bit. that, it doesn't, Rey ends up becoming this idea of possessing both light side and dark side abilities, but the Jedi and what they wanted to do was right, even if they didn't accomplish it, and that's why she has to evolve along with everything.
It is somewhat addressed in Last Jedi too, because I know it is a lot about like balance and order, but like I guess it comes from the prequels too, because the prequels are very like critical about like Sith and Jedi. Most of the bad things that happen in the prequel trilogy is because of the Jedi. Like they ignore a lot of things. They're kind of insufficient in a lot of ways. And I think that's what Last Jedi was trying to like compromises between like the original trilogy of being like good versus evil, and then the prequel trilogy where that's more gray, and then Rise of Skywalker goes back to just being good and bad. Like that final fight scene between Palpatine and Rey is supposed to be like a literal representation of all the Sith fighting all the Jedi. Meanwhile, there's all the fleets fighting each other in the sky.
As clear in our last podcast, I agree that there has to be a certain level of admission that the Jedi fail, because they did terribly. But like I said, I think this is still, to me, it's still tied to this idea. First of all, Palpatine now becomes the focus of 9 movies, if you want to see it that way. Like, Palpatine is the bad guy in this entire saga. Because we know that, he manipulated Anakin. He then tries to get Anakin to kill his son, and Anakin finally turns back to the light side as he, essentially is about to die. And it's almost the similar thing here with Kylo Ren, where maybe if there was one change I would have made personally is I might have had Kylo Ren survive, just to make it like an even greater triumph of good. But I think this is where you get into that Terrio sort of writing, where I think there's an implication of that. I think that Rey comes out of this knowing that what the Jedi did before didn't work, so she's going to have to do it differently. And she has all the knowledge of what did work and what didn't work. But good is still good. And she's going to do her best to make sure that evil doesn't try to take over, which Palpatine has now become the focal point of. His plans and his, lessons that he learned from his masters are what screwed the universe for what at this point would be, like 67 years, right?
Yeah. It's like almost 100 years. There's at least 3 generations.
Right. It's a big portion of time. And the problem in that big portion of time has been Palpatine, which is how this movie kind of reframes everything.
Yeah, I guess I just don't agree with it having to be Palpatine. Like, you already had things that, like, you already had, like, Kylo Ren set up as the main antagonist of this trilogy. And I guess Rise of Skywalker is more focused on building, like, the saga rather than this specific trilogy. And I think that's where a lot of frustration with people comes in with, because it is, like, trying to build a much bigger story than perhaps the Disney trilogy was originally trying to be.
I would agree to that to a certain extent. That's something we're going to get into with the rumors, too, of what may or may not have happened with these scripts. This is the weird thing with storytelling in the way that we do it now. Anything that happens in any of these movies affects 5 other scripts now. So there has to be a little bit of cohesion. There has to be a somewhat of a status quo. Like, as weird as that sounds, I felt like this movie did a really good job of having every era kind of have a point and a few unique aspects. Moving on from like the kind of Rey, Jedi, Sith, Kylo Ren stuff, because I think that in a lot of ways that's the frame for the better things that happen. I think this is the first movie where Finn is a character. One of my favorite things in this movie is that they do establish that Finn leaving the First Order had an effect on the First Order and got some people to realize that things were bad.
Yeah, I like that aspect too. But it's also like, because Terrio does so many things at once, like you don't also get to super explore that either, but you kind of do too. It's a very interesting film in that respect, because it introduces a lot of ideas that can be expanded upon later on.
Right, and I would say the same, like, and this is one of the reasons I do really like it and I hold it pretty highly, is I think the original trilogy did that a lot too, where you weren't getting direct explanations on things and they opened up these doors. The problem now is we do have so much media and people are so familiar with the stories that I think the criticisms are going to be harsher no matter what you do.
Yeah.
And I think that the prequel trilogy deserved a lot of the harsh criticism. And I think that's another podcast that, hey, we're stuck in quarantine for a while. We certainly know those movies. I think that's an entire podcast in itself, too, is kind of what are the positives and negatives that were happening with the prequels. To me, this is the first of the 3 Disney main numbered movies that felt like a real Star Wars movie. And, I heavily, heavily criticized Force Awakens. Heavily. And I felt like Last Jedi was, Rian Johnson trying to correct what had gone wrong there and take things into a new direction, which is what I think any writer would have done. But when we get into the rumors, that might not have been the case as much as we think. I don't. There's nothing in this movie that I dislike enough to make me dislike it. And I saw it twice in theaters, and I didn't feel like the pacing ever slowed, and I felt like it was always fun.
I agree with you that it does feel more Star Wars than like The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi felt, because The Last Jedi felt more like trying to wrap all these like loose ends together into one film, because there's a lot of like things it was trying to concentrate together. But when you look at like The Last Skywalker, it is just like a fun action movie, which kind of was what Star Wars, the original trilogy was. Like, it wasn't anything more complicated than that. It's certainly not. It's certainly more faster paced than whatever it was in the original trilogy, because it does kind of feel like 2 films crammed together.
And I think that's maybe where we can start talking about the comments that Chris Terrio had made. He very explicitly said that he would have loved to have 2 movies to tell the story, but they couldn't, which, the way the numbered Star Wars movies work, I guess you could break that precedent, but everyone was expecting a trilogy. And I'm sure the studio is expecting to spend money on a trilogy and not 4 movies. Yeah, there is a weakness in that it seems like it's 2 movies pushed into 1 movie. But, Terrio said that they started from scratch on this script once they were assigned it. And that, anything that may have come in from what Abrams originally intended, was his prerogative. Not, Terrio didn't really have any knowledge of that directly, so he was working with Abrams on that. Do you think we should start to get into this rumor? I think we're already there.
I think so. Yeah, we're already getting into it, whether you want to or not.
So, going into this part of the podcast, I think both Christian and I, we pride ourselves on trying to do real research here. There are a lot of rumors that are very, let's go with cohesive, that are floating around about what happened with this particular Star Wars trilogy. We got into the last one about how many writers and directors were changing, sort of mid-development and everything. So what I'm about to present, do not see as fact. See as the culmination of a bunch of rumors that all really lined up and what may have happened while these films are going to production. Do you think that's fair, Christian?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we'll never truly know the whole story unless somebody decides to blab it, which it seems like the director of Last Jedi almost did a couple times there.
Yeah, there's been a couple, and that's why, I'm not dismissing these rumors as quickly as you might, because the truth of the matter is some rumors are true. Stuff comes out of Hollywood, there are problems, things happen. But so I'm going to present a narrative here that is really a combination of a bunch of different rumors that have popped up that may explain why they had to do essentially 2 movies in 1 movie for this, and why J.J. Abrams was there and gone and then back. As we talked about in the previous podcast, George Lucas was originally brought on as a creative advisor. The rumors are that he, Kathleen Kennedy, Bob Iger, the chairman of Disney, and J.J. Abrams had originally laid out sort of a general idea of where Star Wars was going to go. This would have included everything. Like, you have to think about this on like a Disney level, that this is Galaxy's Edge, part of the theme park. This is the TV shows. This is Solo. This is whatever other movies are supposed to be in that Star Wars anthology that we'll never get. The rumor goes that Abrams was working on Force Awakens, basically started getting changes while they were shooting, which kind of kneecapped what he wanted to do. A lot of this being based on Rian Johnson's Last Jedi script, which apparently was getting more support within Lucasfilm. And the timing on this kind of works out that, they're going into production on The Last Jedi. Iger gets wind of this, finds out that they threw out all these ideas that they were supposed to work on, basically begs Abrams to come back to finish what they had laid out. But The Last Jedi is already too far into production, but that's why Colin Trevorrow sort of loses that job with that script that apparently has leaked, and I've read parts of that. That would have been more of a direct sequel to The Last Jedi. The idea is Abrams comes back in and kind of corrects back to what they had originally agreed upon, but instead of having 2 more movies for this to happen, he only has 1. Supposedly, the plot points that would have been played up in those movies would have been the sort of rebellion of the stormtroopers who find out about Finn leaving, and also a grander divide between the First Order side that's more military and the First Order that is more Sith. That kind of makes sense to me just because I have a feeling you wouldn't have had Phasma die and you would have had Hux and Phasma really leading the military side, and then you would have had perhaps Palpatine, Kylo Ren, and the Knights of Ren being the more Sith side. But I think we'd all have to agree that the amount of material that is being presented and those type of ideas that end up in The Rise of Skywalker would have been better served with 2 movies.
It's weird because The Last Jedi was pretty, I don't want to say abhorrent, but it's such a different feeling. And then compared to Rise of Skywalker, it's a different feeling too. But it's funny reading the Trevorrow script and then watching Rise of Skywalker because it does deal with a lot of similar things. And that's what's interesting to me is where kind of the themes overlap with each other and where the themes also don't overlap. Like things like Rey being Palpatine's daughter in The Rise of Skywalker while her still being a nobody in the Trevorrow script and how those things resolve differently.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially because a couple things have come out with that. Terrio says they started from scratch. That he wasn't reading the Trevorrow script when they were working on The Rise of Skywalker. I don't think that's a lie necessarily, even if there are things that line up, because there are certain directions you're going to end up going in no matter what. I think after The Last Jedi, I think any writer is going to look at The Last Jedi and there's certain things you have to pick up. So I think that's probably true that they didn't go back in. A real interesting tidbit that's come out is Daisy Ridley has said that she was told during The Force Awakens by J.J. Abrams that she was going to be Palpatine's granddaughter.
I did not know that.
So
that's really interesting.
She came out and said that, and that was her perception through the entire thing. So I think what happened is, and this is, like I said, we're kind of now reviewing back into rumor, but we're trying to take all the information that we have. I think Abrams had an outline for 3 movies. I think Johnson went in a whole total left turn. I think that pissed off people. They brought Abrams back to correct it. And now they ended in the place that they want to end. And I think the place that they ended is good for everyone because, one, you never really need to pick up what happens to Rey after that. I'm sure they will at some point. But you now have 3 really viable eras with a ton of stuff to play with, like in between, which is absolutely what they're doing. I mean, that confirmation that came out a couple of days ago that we're getting Ahsoka in live action and that it's probably Rosario Dawson leads me to believe we're going to get a ton of in-between storytelling, which is pretty much what I want from Star Wars at this point.
Yeah, this is usually where you get the more interesting stuff outside the original trilogy. I feel like the original trilogy kind of stands perfectly alone. But like the prequels and now the Disney trilogy need a lot of other supplemental materials to kind of back it up. I do want to say I do prefer the left turn of The Last Jedi, but I do see where J.J. Abrams is going all this. They're trying to make a bigger story.
And and this is where I am torn, as a writer.
Yeah.
I get what Johnson wanted to do. Like, I 100% get it. And part of me does wish I got to see where that would have gone. But I think the Abrams-Terrio conclusion works so much better with everything else that's happened, since, the first Star Wars movie came out and all the things that they're saying are canon. I think that direction makes way more sense, with the overall story, which is just massive at this point.
Yeah, because you're trying to build a 9-movie saga, and like what The Last Jedi gave you did not give you a 9-movie saga. It gave you like an interesting movie, and a movie you could chew a lot on. But it was not like this over grand narrative that tied Luke, Leia, Palpatine, everybody together. Anakin, Darth Vader, Rey. It was something completely different. It is. I mean, the rumor is that like Kathleen Kennedy like really liked Last Jedi and everybody else didn't, and I could see why she didn't. But it is interesting to see like now there's two different like Star Wars fans, like those that really like Last Jedi, and those that like Rise of Skywalker. Before it was those that like the prequels and those that like the original. And I feel like those two sides want kind of different things from the series. And I think that's where the Rise of Skywalker really fares, is trying to unite the fan base.
Yeah, but I don't think you can unite the fan base anymore, and I'm glad you said that. There's just too much material. Like, Star Wars used to be you liked three things, and if you could agree that you like these three things, then, you know, you were a Star Wars fan. Now, Star Wars is going to mean 100 different things to everyone. It always did, but it's less obvious when there's less material. I think it's never going away. Like, Star Wars is going to be around for a real long time. And people are going to like or dislike whatever comes out in kind of a more natural way now. I think there's no real cohesive opinions either. I don't feel like there's a divide. I don't feel like there's this type of Star Wars fan and then another type. I think we're going to see all these variations and all these interpretations, and that's good because going forward, that'll give a lot of fuel to what's going to be written. But I think the thing that everyone has to realize is that you're probably not going to like all of Star Wars ever again. I don't think it's possible.
No, I agree to that. Even with the prequels, it was kind of impossible. I mean, there were definitely people that did like them because all of them had cool lightsabers stuff. But here, they're all so thematically different at this point, and so like plot different too, and character different. Like characters act differently from episode to episode at this, and it's just, as a fan, it's hard to deal with. And it's interesting comparing it to like comics or other franchises too. Like Transformers doesn't deal with this. Like every different Transformer is different. Comics doesn't really deal with this either because comic fans have just kind of accepted like alternate reality, and they're able to say like, this is an alternate reality. I like this writer's run, and they're able to accept that they're different interpretations. But where I think Star Wars starts to struggle with is trying to make one cohesive Star Wars when there's many different types of Star Wars at this point. Like even looking at the Clone Wars and the Mandalorian, they're both Star Wars, but they're very different Star Wars. Like the Mandalorian's very different than the Clone Wars show.
I agree with that. You know, it's all, you know, and that's cool because you're basically like, you know, serving different types of stories and things too. I think Abrams and Terrio did a good job of getting pretty intrinsic versions of the characters into the Rise of Skywalker. I actually really like, I almost like the differences between Luke and Last Jedi and in Rise of Skywalker because it feels kind of like a real person to me. Where like he gets depressed and then he makes bad decisions and then he comes back and he's like, you know what, I fucked that up. Like that is cool. And I think actually C-3PO in this is the best C-3PO since the original trilogy. He plays like the most natural. It's the right type of humor as far as I'm concerned for him. I also really like Babu Frick, but no one wants to talk about that. I thought he was going to be big. I thought there'd be a lot of merchandise. I think it really is though. Like it has broken down to this point of like Star Wars. Star Wars is more like comics have been, where I like DC Comics. It doesn't mean I like every comic they put out. It doesn't mean I'm not going to acknowledge those characters. It just means that I live knowing that not everything is written for me. And I think Star Wars has finally reached that point. And I think some people have a hard time handling that. That Star Wars is so broad now that it's a different beast than it ever was.
I think it's reaching that point now. Because like with comics, like they really like they've been around since World War I, World War II, you know, like they've been around for 100 years at this point. So you had different generations coming in. Star Wars is still in this weird point where there's still like the original generation that grew up with, and now the next generation that's growing up. And they're still like contending with each other. And like comics never really had that much of a problem. Even now, even throughout the 90s and 80s, it never really had that strange contention going on.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on that. I think the timing's actually extremely similar because if you're lining up, you know, Star Wars starts at the end of the 70s, right? So we're, you know, 40-ish years away from that. That's about the time you get the Bronze Age in comics where you have that massive proliferation of concepts, of interpretations, I think it's extremely similar. I think it almost matches. I think it's a really, and you're right that the fact that you still have that original generation invested and the newer generations invested, but I think where maybe you downplayed it a little bit is how many generations that is now. Arguably, we're in different generations from when we saw them, and there's at least one generation in between mine and the original one. Like, this is a huge difference in view of these movies and what was how you saw them. Like, my generation, one of the first that was playing a lot of games that had a lot of story into it, and that affects how we see Star Wars. It's a really interesting effect that's happened, especially because now Disney owns it and it can be as big as it is. It's like I said, Star Wars is going to be 20 different things at all times now, and liking Star Wars is going to be liking, half of those things at a time.
Yeah, it's kind of the same with comics too. You only really like half of the issues, but it's not because like any of them are strongly different. It's because some of them are boring and some of them are more interesting than the others. And I think part of that's because of how big Star Wars is. Like, it's always been this multi-million-dollar franchise that is able to advertise everywhere. Comics never really had that. All these other franchises never really had that throughout their entire history. Star Wars always did. And I think that's part of the reason why there's such strong camps forming now about what Star Wars should be and what it isn't.
And I think that's where it gets a little silly. If you're saying what Star Wars should be, that's a very different type of opinion. Like, I can tell you what I like and I don't like in Star Wars. I can tell you, what kind of story I probably wouldn't be that interested in and what kind of story I think is really cool. Trying to say something is right or wrong is the biggest problem that the internet has. First of all, they're stories. First of all, if you don't, you read the first book and you hated the second book, guess what? You still liked the first book. It's getting to this weird fever pitch in social media where it's just constant, where people are like, that's wrong. And it's no, it's not wrong, because it's not right or wrong. It's a story.
Yeah, it's just odd, and you can even see that throughout this production cycle too. J.J. Abrams had a very different version of Star Wars than Trevorrow did, or even Kathleen Kennedy did, and now even Eisner did. So it's all these different. You even see it in the higher ups. Usually you think, the higher ups have a stronger hand on this. They don't. They don't know either.
Right, because it's all perception. It's all trying to figure out what people want and what will be interesting. And I think what we've ultimately seen, and this is a nice little cap on even the other podcasts, is what we've ultimately seen is, instead of Star Wars being controlled by one man, essentially, who controlled it for years, and when you liked it, you gave him credit, and when you hated it, you said you hated him. I didn't say I hated him. Some people did. Now that it is probably more open than it ever was, as weird as that sounds, as far as the opportunities for different creatives to work on it, we're starting to see how different everyone's perception of it is. And that's probably a really good thing for Star Wars ultimately. Just like we said, don't expect to like everything.
Yeah, I think that's where a big problem with this lies, is because you see such a gap with the audience reviews and the critical reviews, because the critical reviews are much kinder to it. They're oh, it's a Star Wars movie. And then the audience reviews are much more this is a great Star Wars movie or it's a horrible Star Wars movie.
Right. I've seen as many people posting about how they cried at the end of the movie as absolutely hated it. And that's the truth. I really like it. I think it's a really cool movie. And to me, it gives me what I want out of Star Wars. But I get where the people who have the argument from The Last Jedi, where they wanted that story, are annoyed, but the idea is to not be annoyed. The idea is wage your criticism and make sure you're criticizing the story and also not acting like this is a huge deal.
Yeah, it's because at the end of the day, there's still the Star Wars movies that you like. They don't change because of any of this. Darth Vader's not suddenly a good guy now or anything.
Who knows? I think it'll be interesting if maybe in 20 years, when you have a completely distanced generation, that they're mad that Anakin turned into Darth Vader.
Yeah, because there's so much media of Anakin being a good guy now, isn't
Yeah,
like
and
more?
that's no different from what anyone is saying from where these other movies went. That's a yeah. I wonder if
We
that's
might get
gonna.
into that with
I'm
Kylo
excited.
Ren.
I'm gonna look out for that.
I do say I think Kylo Ren's more interesting as a villain than he is as like Ben Solo, but that might change because I thought the same thing about Darth Vader until the
Right.
Clone Wars started to happen.
Yeah, it's yeah. No, Star Wars is a galaxy of possibilities. Can I get a teach? Can they hire me? Can they give me one? Um, but I think that's a good place to end because that's a pretty positive note. Is Star Wars is going to be good, and you're going to also hate it.
Yeah. Just like many other franchises like Star Trek.
Right. Oh man, I maybe we should do some like CBS All Access Star Trek. That could be an episode. People get real riled up about that one. But I think that brings us to sort of our end of this discussion. As you said before, if you're a fan of new or old Star Wars and you like to have some Star Wars things, check out ToyStoreGuide.com. Especially now, a lot of these, all of these toy stores that are listed on ToyStoreGuide.com are independent, and right now, I am sure they would be happy to mail order you whatever you're looking for. Just take a look out there. A lot of these places are going to need your business. And if you want to get some Power of the Force figures from the 90s, because that's what you like, you can get those. If you want to get some 70s figures and pay a ton of money, you can do that too. But ToyStoreGuide.com, good resource. If you're looking to follow up with us, we are on all major podcast platforms. We are on most major social media. Just look for Dissecting Fiction. And always follow us, 5-star us, give us a thumbs up. Whatever the good thing is you can do on that site, just do it for us.
And make sure to always give us thumbs up, never thumbs down. And
Yeah.
comment about your opinions on the Rise of Skywalker because it is pretty contentious, and we would like to hear your opinions on it, or even your opinions on our podcast and what you like to see more from us. Because we're always willing to adapt and we're always looking to improve.
Yeah, this episode is largely a result of feedback we've gotten, which is great. We love to hear stuff, positive, negative. We don't love to hear negative, but but I think that brings us to the end of this one. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And may the Force be with you.